Welcome back, fans of Retro Warhammer. Today we have a very special model, the Bloodletter. So, these guys, yeah, if you were collecting a Chaos Army, I think you would rightly be excused for not being very excited at the prospect of including these guys in your army. I I find them kind of weirdly lackluster. Um, Yeah, despite being, supposed to be the literal soldiers of Khorne, right? Like embodiments of supposedly the most powerful Chaos God out of the pantheon of four: Khorne, Slanesh, Tzeentch, and Nagash? Slanesh, heresy. The Bloodletter was kind of the least impressive out of the lot. And I don't entirely know why this was the case because look, so everybody else had the ability to cast magic, right? But Korn doesn't like magic. But I feel like he wasn't exactly compensated either for the loss of this ability because everybody else clocks in at a lot more points. Bloodletters just get to be fairly cheap and affordable as demons go. Maybe this was intentional because the rest of the armies was already so costly and sort of over the top in terms of price. That maybe what they really wanted was to give players what they call a points break via the Bloodletter unit. This is fourth edition that we're talking about, by the way. There were two iterations of the Chaos Army in fourth edition. One of them was Warhammer Armies Chaos, which is the earlier of the two, and then the later one was Warhammer Armies Realm of Chaos, which also had Champions of Chaos as a supplement, which sort of detailed the characters and so on. But in both versions, the Bloodletters kind of come across as slightly underpowered, which is very strange because in an edition where magic can really turn the tide of the battle quite substantially, it was weird that they didn't really have the ability to cast magic. Not that it was weird thematically; it's just that it's weird that they got nothing in return for it. They did, however, do D3 wounds per model, and that led to some really hilarious circumstances. Because essentially, Bloodletters were the ultimate glass cannon. They could do a shocking amount of damage, especially when in combat with something that could, tank normally multiple wounds. The Bloodletters would just scythe through them, and it was just pretty hilarious to sort of see something like a chariot sometimes, which typically had several wounds, charge into Bloodletters, inflict a couple of wounds that would typically be saved by their demonic ward save of 4 plus, and then in return the Bloodletters would absolutely shred the chariot because every wound that was unsaved would basically become D3 wounds, and so the chariot would more or less get blasted apart. Likewise, you would have units like ogres that would sort of go into combat with Bloodletters, and it would be pretty vicious on both sides, which was an interesting kind of way of approaching the concept of Bloodletters. Anyway, before we get too far, let's talk about paints. Today, I'm using Vallejo Xpress paint, specifically Plasma Red, which is their bright red color. And I think maybe we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the differences between Contrast and Vallejo Express color. I kind of like both ranges. I kind of feel like both ranges have different functions that we can leverage on because they have very different features. So as you can see, Plasma Red is going on, and it's actually really bright for a Contrast or an Express style kind of color. It goes on really. It has very distinct, shall we say, highs and lows, brights and lights and darks, and this lends itself quite well actually to painting over very defined surfaces. So heartily recommend if you are in the practice of painting models, or you expect to be painting models that want to be bright and kind of defined. But at the same time, I feel like this paint on its own doesn't really have the punch to get some nice dark contrasts as well. So what I'm going to do is, at the end of the day, is use this plasma red as the base coat for us to get all that nice surface relief, get a little bit of contrast going on the surface. And then after that, we're going to come in with our usual blood mix, which is Blood Angels red mixed with Gryphcharger orange from Citadel. And we're going to apply that over some of the key areas, specifically the recesses. So we're going to force the shading again as usual, basically by spot applying it to where it's needed. And that hopefully will give us quite a nice attractive finish, because I do like the way this looks kind of bright and, visually quite arresting. And which is why I've chosen it for a model like this, which is predominantly red. My fear is that if I use my usual red mix on this model, there might not be enough variation between the lights and darks on the model. So I would prefer to kind of start with this, let it do what it can to elucidate the bright points, and then after that we'll come back in and we'll sort of enhance some areas with just our regular contrast mix. Get the idea? So hopefully that gives us a nice sort of like bright, lots of value across the model, as in tonal value, and that gives us a model that sort of reads well from afar and has quite a nice range of colors appearing across the surface. I do really like the way when you apply Xpress colors, it does separate and settle very well, and it tends to come across as very smooth as well, which is really nice. But as you can see, it's almost not punchy enough. So we'll see how this hybrid approach does for us. But for getting this like one coat kind of down and putting an initial amount of like visual difference between lights and darks, you got to say the Xpress colors do really well. And I guess what I really like most about the Xpress colors is that they are a really good complement to the Citadel lineup of contrast paints. They don't really replace them. Rather, they give you more colors that you could use, and I really use them a lot in that respect. And I'm glad that they don't invalidate my collection of Citadel contrasts, which at this point is fairly large. They just simply give me more colors to kind of add variety to my toolkit, and that makes me a happy boy. So I am putting on the red, and as you can see, it's already starting to have an effect on the surface. Very pleasing one. In fact, it settles nicely. It seems to take a little bit longer to dry, but maybe that's because my country is just so goddamn humid. I don't know whether this is a significant difference. Wherever you might be, your mileage will vary. So just be sure to test this out on something first before you put it on a prized model, or I don't know, competition entry or anything that you really need to sort of get out your best quality for. Test it out first and see how you get the most value out of this range of paints, because they really are very nice. They do go on very smooth. They smell a bit funky, but that's okay. That's not a big deal. Yeah, so I think this is looking quite good actually. Yeah, I'm really liking how vibrant and sort of like bright chili red this is turning out to be. It's kind of almost orange, but then again they did warn us by calling it plasma red. Fair enough. So some kind of its incandescent heat is already implied, I suppose. So my usual practice, let me just sort of get his central squid head first. Yep. And sorry, please pardon the strange noises. Right, cool. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so that was a fairly quick application. Very little fuss, and I see very little coffee staining or pooling, and in fact the finish is kind of smooth and pleasant all over. The only problem is, from this stage on, I can't intensify it, or it seems to not want to become any more intense with repeated application. So my usual modus operandi would be to take the same contrast paint and kind of like layer it like more heavily. So say for example this crease, I can pile in more color, but maybe because of the shade of this, it doesn't get more intense. The range of colors from light to dark seems to stop at a fairly light color. And yes, I can certainly add a little bit more of this into the recesses, but it doesn't kind of build up that pleasing sort of shade. And it doesn't seem to have kind of the dynamic range that our typical blood mix is. It, however, does serve to already provide a pre-highlight, and it's for that reason that I've decided to use this. So anything that kind of uses very large amounts of what I want to be very bright red, really eye-catching sort of fire engine red, I like using this method because it gives me straight away, the high points that I want, and then it's just a case of how I want to intensify certain areas to make them darker and more appealing later. Anyway, back on that in a bit. So the next thing that we're going to work on is his Hellblade, which is very impressive weapon over here. Basically that very thing that gives the D3 wounds that we were just talking about not long ago. The Hellblade is the one claim to fame that Bloodletters have. They certainly have an unremarkable stat line in almost every way, which is strange because they're Bloodletters, right? They're supposed to be fairly scary and intimidating, but for some bizarre reason, they don't quite have that reputation across both books. So I'm applying Mantis Warriors Green first of all. This is going to establish this kind of like warpstone green kind of color. And I am using green because, well, it's Christmas. No, seriously. I think green and red is the master combo for this faction. I think drawing attention to their bright red skin, which is a feature of Bloodletters in general, and then after that, drawing attention to the business end of a Bloodletter, which is essentially their weapon, is kind of a winning combination because this weapon is 80 to 85% of why people remember Bloodletters at all. The remaining sort of 20% being due to their annoying demonic ward save, which we will get to in a bit. So, Hellblades. There's a bit of a typo in the 4th edition Realm of Chaos book. So, I don't remember which one is the actual answer, but I'm choosing to go with the version that says that it's D3 wounds. So, in the bestiary section, it says that Hellblades do D3 wounds. In the army list, however, this is changed to D3 hits per hit caused by the Bloodletter. All things considered, both are terrifying. If I had to pick which version of the rules I would want, honestly, I would want the D3 hits. Simply because, generally speaking, when you hit a model with D3 wounds and it only has one wound, nothing happens. That model just dies extra bad, right? It does just dies with aplomb. It basically vanishes in a red mist. Kind of overkill, frankly. However, if you do D3 hits for every hit that you cause, that is spectacular because that would mean that with their really high weapon skill of 5, demons tend to hit their targets just fine. And if you then go on to do D3 hits per hit inflicted initially, you could really explode a unit. So, all things considered, I don't know which version the authors intended because I'm sure there was an FAQ somewhere, but I just don't have it to hand. And frankly, I haven't played like enough 5th edition games to have encountered any rules or rulings on this matter. But yeah, the idea of going from one hit to D3 is staggering, just in terms of the kind of abuse that you can inflict on relatively average troops. In other words, if you do D3 hits, it greatly helps you against regular armed and armored sort of single wound models. So your Empire Halberdiers, your High Elf Spearmen, all of these units would just absolutely get mullet by a unit of Bloodletters. If you give him D3 wounds, then you have the bizarre situation of this unit being very effective against large opponents, like ogres, like chariots, like characters. You would be very worried about engaging a unit of bloodletters with a hero or a powerful lord, because essentially he could vanish in one single hit from one of these guys. Because doing up to 3 wounds apiece is not cool, especially since they have 2 attacks and a relatively high weapon skill. So they will land hits, and they will like evaporate characters in a really fast and frankly kind of terrifying fashion. So I don't really know where the intention lies for this. I know which I would prefer, because I think bloodletters need additional help against rank and file. I don't think they need additional help against characters, which are fairly rare, or multiple wound targets, which are also fairly rare. Anyway, like D3 hits would kind of help in both situations anyway. So I know what I would prefer, but I don't know what the actual intention of the rules writers was. Yeah, so bloodletters, I guess, dangerous in combat. Yeah, but variable depending on which version you use. I've just put out a bit of silver onto his cuffs and onto the hilt of his weapon. Coverage is not 100% right now because it's still slightly damp. I am going to touch up a little bit more red before I think I hit the hairdryer. So yeah, give me a second. Back in a bit. Okay, so moving on to touch up the rest of the silver, including all those areas that we might have missed earlier because things weren't fully dry yet. I'm going to do the hilt of his weapon, and that extends all the way around the back really, and even this tiny sliver between his head and his hands, which is easy to miss out on. So yeah, I guess one thing I think I learned very early on when painting miniatures was to sort of be exhaustive about rotating the miniature every which way in order to sort of figure out whether or not I covered all angles. Because we're painting 3-dimensional objects, it helps to rotate the miniature to sort of see whether we've gotten every single corner. And when I first started painting, honestly, that threw me for a loop a little bit, because I knew how to do 2-dimensional coloring, but for 3-dimensional stuff, I often wondered whether or not I should be getting the edges and sort of the hidden faces or facets of a surface. Uh, Spoiler alert: yes, you should, um, because those areas kind of look better when painted as 3-dimensional objects. But what you want to do is to have some kind of a hard border, or some kind of a defining barrier between 2 areas, 2 adjacent colors, so that they help stand up basically against each other. I mean, the perfect example would be if you were to have like a light colored, bone colored object, for example, against like white fabric. Those 2 colors are both so light and so close to each other that you really do need to make sure that you've got some kind of dark shading in between. And you achieve this either by way of a black line or just having a more intense version of the color. So in the case of white, you would use gray. In the case of bone, you would use maybe some shade of brown, hopefully a slightly desaturated one, so that it doesn't change the color too much towards being more of a leather tone or something. So I would use a desaturated brown. Yeah, some kind of a tan or khaki would be ideal. Yeah, cool. So our boy is coming along, and he's got a tiara, which is very pretty, through which his horns are emerging. And we'll get to the horns in a bit. But for now, I think the thing that I want to do is to sort of correct the shape of the red areas around this a little bit, because I left out the top and also the sides. Cool. Right, so we're going to jump in and strengthen the green now, because the green is fairly mild. Mantis Warriors green is a fairly polite green. It doesn't like completely obliterate the surface with dark color or intense color, but it tends to leave a really beautiful kind of highlight, as it were, or pre-highlight by pulling away from the surface. The flip side of this is that sometimes you do need to come in and re-establish the color a little bit, because we want this color to be fairly intense. Hellblades are supposed to be scary and intimidating. They're supposed to be smoking with evil energy, so to speak, or killing intent. And yeah, that's another big thing about Bloodletter. So at 4th edition, we don't quite have the other cool epithets that Bloodletters later on receive in later army books, because there are lots of names that come with the Bloodletters that kind of extend the meaning of the name. Bloodletting, of course, is a medieval practice that was used to basically treat certain ailments. But the flip side of this, of course, is that bloodletting also means to basically drain the blood out of something. To sort of exsanguinate a person would mean that you drain the person of blood. So bloodletting is it can be used to mean violence as well. Any act of sort of liberating blood from a living creature could be called bloodletting. So it's an interesting kind of dichotomy that we're looking at, I suppose. Although I don't think there's anything really meant by it. But the other names are kind of really quite interesting. I like high-handed killers, high-handed slayers, I mean. And that's really interesting because it really brings to mind the idea that bloodletters are embodiments of Khorne's martial prowess. So really, it's the idea that they overmatch anyone that they fight with, and I quite like that name, high-handed slayers. I think it sounds quite unique. Also, they were called Teeth of Death, which were, I mean, it's the most metal thing. So it's the most metal name you could have given anything. But then again, these are literal demons, right? I mean, it doesn't matter that you spell them DAE, but they're supposed to be demons, and these are, I guess, the most traditional looking of the demons. So that's just a bit of Black Templar to kind of shade the Teruges. These sort of like leather strips. The detail on the leather strips are a little bit shallow, which is not great. But, well, I think it turns out okay. Yeah, so just a little bit on the Teruges to do that. I think I want to do the underside as well, because it's a little sort of inconvenient shelf below that I just want to downplay. I could do that all in gold, which is eventually what I intend to do for the facing surface, the surface that faces us. But I kind of don't want to do them all as gold because it's just too much. It's just too much gold in a place that's supposed to be understated. So I'll just come back in. I'll just apply a bit of black on the underside on this underface, which is something that you find that you have to do a lot with these earlier models. It's just how they are. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Teeth of Death, such a cool name. I mean, it's a bit cheesy. I'm not gonna lie. It's a little bit much. Especially especially how looking at how unimpressive the actual bloodletters were. Except in very specific situations where you were in combat with units that would be either hurt very badly by D3 wounds. So imagine if you were to face off against units of mercenary ogres, for example, or if you were facing off against a dragon, you could really cleave a dragon apart. But anybody worth his salt isn't going to charge your bloodletter with anything that's worthy of being killed, right? Or anything that's particularly vulnerable. So we're coming in with the red wash and we're applying this as a shade, as a controlled shade to basically areas that could do with a little bit more definition. And you can really sort of see the difference in intensity between the two contrast paints mixed together as opposed to the Xpress paint, right? Like the intensity is huge. And to be honest, I find this the case across like this specific situation. I guess I find quite commonly across all of the Xpress paints. Generally speaking, they come across as a bit weak, unless you use the next color down, the next darker color. In other words, if you use layers, if you want to layer up your Xpress colors to get this sort of pre-shading, pre-highlighted effect, the way we do it with Citadel paints, you're going to need the next darkest Xpress color, because applying multiple layers of the same color isn't going to achieve any kind of intensity. So just bear that in mind as you're shopping for paints. Other than that, I love these paints. I think they're really good for what they do, but they sort of reach, ironically, they sort of reach their sort of very best when combined with either shade paints of some kind. And Vallejo do make their own shade paints, right? So it's not as if they've left you high and dry and shopping for alternatives. But I find the contrast paint line a more complete range in that sense. If I only had space in my collection for one set of paints, I'm afraid the contrast paints still do a more complete job. And from what I see, browsing some of the best painters' work on YouTube, I think a lot of people would agree with me on that. Contrast paint is still a more complete paint range and still kind of more efficient, I guess. But this gives us a range of color that is very pleasing, and frankly gives us new options when it comes to working with translucent paints, just in glazes and in kind of shades like this. So yeah, your mileage will vary, test it out, but there's a lot to love here, and a lot of colors that Games Workshop hasn't done with their contrast paint line. So think of it as a good way to extend your colors that you can bring to bear on your models. Anyway, yeah, Bloodletters, kind of an oddball unit. So the fact that these guys can't cast spells because Khorne don't do magic means that these were far and away the cheapest of the demons, at about 20 points per piece. I think across both 4th edition army books, they are the same cost, and that's a bit unfortunate because there's not a lot to recommend them other than their very situational ability to deal many wounds, which is not bad. But they are also an infantry unit and a fairly slow one. They move at basically regular trooper speed. They do have the option for the Blood Horn, which is what happens when you buy a musician for a demon unit, and that really allows them to march everywhere, even within 8 inches of enemy. Now that is an interesting option because having multiple units of Bloodletters means that they can absolutely march into your flanks, which is hilarious. To put it in context, right, they basically move as fast as cavalry when they are march blocked. That honestly can be terrifying because with 8 inches of movement, they can get out of charge arcs of other infantry, they can slip into the flanks of other units. So having multiple units of Bloodletters, the sort of so-called MSU approach to gameplay, really made Bloodletters quite scary because they could very quickly encircle and beat down a more sort of encumbered or slower enemy army. Bear in mind that this is the edition where wearing heavy armor essentially cuts down your movement by 1 point. So you're basically making already slow movement 4 units, essentially movement 3, which is dwarf speed. And that's really crawling, right? So that's not ideal. So you could get these guys who could march around at 8 inches, and that was kind of terrifying. So these kinds of, I guess, not very subtle, or rather subtle strengths, I would say, made it so that they were a little bit less popular among newbies because they were a little bit hard to learn, which is unfortunate because Bloodletters are definitely the cheapest unit that you could squeeze into a demon-dominated army. Bear in mind that this is the edition where your Chaos Knights, essentially with the Chaos Armor upgrade, giving them 1+ save, basically clocking at 80 points per pop. I mean, they were worth it, don't get me wrong, but they were 80 points per miniature, and that's pretty ferocious. To put that in context, you can get 4 Bloodletters for the cost of 1 Chaos Knight. Actually, when I think about it, I would rather have 1 Chaos Knight. But yeah, your mileage will vary, I suppose. The other thing that these guys were really good at doing was essentially soaking up hits from mundane attackers, which is why that idea of using them to stop chariots is actually pretty good. Defensively, these guys are just a regular like toughness tree, nothing to write home about, which is weird considering how chunky these guys look. I mean, I don't know, they look like essentially a bunch of Conan the Barbarians running around, bright red with magical versions of like meteoric weapons. So I don't know. That sounds pretty dangerous to me. Yet the rules, I guess, yeah, I guess they're not the most interesting unit you could use. But that ability to march, I think, is a winner. So long as you shell out the points for the musician, which was already expensive, and bear in mind that that's on top of a unit that a regular army would already consider expensive. Cool. So we are going to move on to its horns and teeth and claws and so on. And with that, we're just going to pop out a little bit of Vallejo Silver Grey and add that on. So I'm predisposed to like the Vallejo colors, right? The Vallejo Xpress colors, because I've been using Vallejo um, colors as my primary paints for a very long time, because I like how they combine with contrast paint, Games Workshop contrast paint. I know, the heresy. Because what you get essentially is the best of both worlds, right? You've got paint that is kind of thick enough to create great highlights, blends, without kind of losing the viscosity, so you can apply good highlights. And then you combine them with the very strong pigmentation of Games Workshop paints. So I guess I was a little bit disappointed to see that some of the Xpress colors come across as a bit weak, because I think when you've got strongly pigmented paints, generally speaking, they're more useful because you can sort of dilute them, you can sort of thin them as needed, you can sort of cut them with other colors, you can mix them more freely, I suppose, depending on what you're trying to achieve out of your set of paints. Um, but the Vallejo Express colors are clearly meant to be used out of the bottle, and that in a way limits your options because you can sort of dilute the paint, you can't strengthen the paint. Letting it dry up on your palette fundamentally changes their properties, so that doesn't really help you. But yeah, so that kind of reduces the ability of these paints in my eyes. So what I try to do is instead focus on the unique colors that add value to the Games Workshop range, and in that sense, Plasma Red is a real winner because I actually prefer this to any bright red that, or rather, I feel like the Citadel range has no bright red. Bale red, for example, gives you nothing in the way of shading, so it might as well not be a contrast paint at that point. So that's terrible. And then Blood Angels red is nowhere near as bright as Plasma red. So Plasma red is a winner as far as I'm concerned, in as far as it does something that the Citadel range doesn't do at all. So uncontested winner for the bright red category. So yeah. Anyway, I've basically gone and applied my gold wash over all the silver, and my typical gold mix is Nazdreg yellow contrast paint with Seraphim Sepia. I think everybody who's watched enough of these videos will know that I use this in practically every single episode wherever there is gold, and I find that it gives me a quick and easy gold that I can sort of calibrate to my needs. I can cut it with more medium in order to make a sort of lighter and more nuanced gold, or I can reapply layers in order to get more intensity. Today, I think I will apply more layers to get more intensity because I think bloodletters are, I mean, they shouldn't be too gaudy and bling. They should be sort of dark and a little bit grim dark, but not too much. I kind of like them in this bright, attractive color. Yeah. So yeah, just a little bit more darkening on the gold so that it doesn't clash with the red. And I think this is looking pretty good. So we turn our attention back to the Hellblade. So I think you can see that I've been actually applying more and more layers of our Mantis Warriors green on the lower half of the blade, and I think we are reaching the point where there is a real sort of gradation between the top and bottom. I am now dropping in some Warpstone green, which is altogether a much bluer green. That means if you think of green as a mix of blue and yellow, I think Warpstone green is very much more in the green in the blue spectrum. Sorry, and basically this is what we can use to add shading to the extremely yellow Mantis Warriors green, and between them we will get the full range of greens, warm and cool, which has the effect of driving your eye to the point of the blade at the top, because that's where it gets really nice and light. So I will continue to blend these two together, kind of like that, right? Applying more Warpstone green at the base because that's the darker area. So we're focusing on the top, almost like a light source. And we're going to end off with a highlight right at the tip later in order to sort of get that gradation across. Yeah, so we are now adding more Warpstone to the intermediate, the sides, and then now we are flipping over to do the back. Just in case you missed it the first time, let's redo it again over here. So it's nothing really special really, just making sure that all of the darker crevices, all of the crevices rather, are marked out in Warpstone green contrast paint. And then as we get to the tip of the blade, we kind of hold back a little bit because we don't want to overdo it. So something like that. And I think that's pretty decent looking. It doesn't take a lot of Warpstone green, but it helps to use this color rather than adding successive layers of Mantis Warriors green, because I think beyond a certain point, adding more and more Mantis Warriors green just gets it like yellower and yellower in a way. As you add shades, it doesn't suddenly hue shift into a more blue green. But when you switch to Warpstone green, you do get the color shift into blue green. And I think that's a really quick and effective way to achieve some kind of a visual gradient by shifting the hue from one end of the green sort of range to the other without actually going through like 10,000 colors or losing saturation, which is the real sort of problem that we're trying to avoid. Cool. I think he's looking much better now that the weapon's a little bit darker. I was getting a bit worried that it was kind of bright and gaudy before. We're going to go on to do our Ancient Bone color. And I think I found a way to articulate why I like this mix of Gryphcharger Grey and Skeleton Horde. I think having a little bit of this blueness in this bone color as opposed to using straight Skeleton Horde, it makes the bone look harder, as in it looks like ossified and kind of fossilized into being very, very hard. And I think that makes a big difference to the way you want harder materials to look, as opposed to using just a straight bone color, which creates a more cream colored bone, which to my eyes at least suggests that it's a softer material. So I really like it when I apply this and then you sort of give it a rudimentary highlight. Or as you just saw me do, wipe off like a whole chunk of the paint with my finger. That works for a quick and dirty highlight as well. Do it with the brush. Don't have to dirty your fingers if you don't want to. I just care very little about it, about how dirty my hands get. So yeah, but if you want to keep your fingers nice and clean, I fully understand. And then we go on to apply this on the lower horns as well. And because this is a fairly understated color, we can let it filter into some of these recesses as well. Still looks good, like so. And yep, making sure that where it meets the metal, it gets especially dark, because that intensity shift is really what we're looking for, as a means of drawing attention to the point of the horns, the sharp points, and also having that separation from the red. Like so. Pretty good. I think I like the way that looks for now. Just a little bit more definition on the sides and back. And I think we are good. So we come back with our silver gray and we start to apply rudimentary highlights. As before, I like to apply a series of striations because that gives the bone a bit of texture. And if you can't put on like multiple striations, well, the number of striations that you want to put on, because these typically may not be sculpted on the model, you want minimally a V shape, right? So you basically have two striations that meet as a V, and that suggests the darker color at the root. But for larger bones, like the horns, you might try to push yourself to do 3, kind of like this, and one more around the edge over here. I mean, you could honestly go like several like striations, but there is an optimum number of striations that you might want to go for, because too many striations and then it starts to kind of get lost and muddy. So too fine, and kind of like these become a lot less visible, a lot less outstanding, and therefore not really worth the added effort and stress of trying to get these perfect. Right? Cool. And then for the horns over here that have the twists, we want to just very carefully try to pick up each of these as neatly as we can. And for this one that it's actually more red than bone, to be honest. You just need to apply the highlights. Oops. Like so. And then we can come in and reshape that as needed. Yeah, that's fine for now. And the other thing that we can do is to just come back with regular plain old white. Nothing fancy. Any brand will do really. To apply the final highlights to kind of rarefy. When I say rarefy, what I mean is when you apply a highlight, it tends to kind of be very bold if it's just full strength color that doesn't sort of fade into the surface in any way. First of all, we rarefy it by painting a spindle shape, so they taper, the highlight tapers in shape, kind of like a spindle shape as it gets towards the base, where we want it to be less visible. And the other thing that we do is that we try to make it less, we try to sort of repeat this spindle shape with smaller and smaller highlights as we go into brighter colors, in particular when we go into white to form the final highlight. Yeah, this becomes more visible as we apply those highlights. So I've gone in with the base mix of bone back into that one horn that we kind of had to work over red. Cool. And then now we want to go back into our gold, layer in a little bit more. Pardon me as I grab a little bit more of our gold mix. Really great color. I recommend you mix some of this stuff. It will change the way you approach painting gold. Maybe make it a little bit more pleasant. You can imagine all you custodes players would be going mad if you had to do all this gold by hand with just layer paints. Sounds really painful. But when you do it with a contrast paint that already gives you a lot of the intensity right out of the bat, especially when applied over a nice bright silver to maximize the contrast distance between bright and dark, you can actually get a really pleasing sort of effect fairly easily. And after that, you're free to highlight and shade it as you will, or just leave it as is and get your models onto the tabletop to play. Your mileage will vary, and you can apply your own judgment in that sense. Cool. A little bit more on the cross guard or lack thereof. Their sword kind of does look a little bit like a giant rondel dagger, but an absolute like 8 foot long rondel dagger, which is kind of terrifying when you think about it. But yeah, or it looks like a paddle pop, like a giant ice cream, giant ice lolly. As the case may be. I think it's just the lime greenness of it that gives me the impression, or I'm just really hungry. As the case may be. Bit of both, really. A little bit more onto his tiara thing. And this time we are making sure that we pick out the spaces in between. And also the fact that, there are these giant rivets. I guess it would make sense that it's kind of nailed onto the surface. It's a little bit uncomfortable, but then they are demons. They are indeed demons. So yeah, I guess my main problem with the way Bloodletters operated was that they were strangely vulnerable to the one thing that was supposed to be their strength, which is magic. So magic made them evaporate really quickly, which is unfortunate. So what I've done is I've taken a little bit of our red mix, our usual red mix, and I put in a bit of Phalanx yellow to get a fairly light orange, and we're just gonna pick out some quick and easy highlights. So the tops of the quadriceps, muscles, and then the knees, a bit of the calves, and then his elbow, right front and center, very prominent indeed. Muscles of his forearms, the biceps, the delts, triceps, and that area is done. You can do his butt, his cake, and more quad muscles. And all of these knuckles, which are all beautifully in rows. Each one of these points gets a little bit of this highlight in order to achieve that brightness. And this weird Thanos chin and cheekbones and his ears. And then there's a lot of definition on his back, which we will get into now. Whew! Whoop. Let's try to remix that, because I think I fouled it. It's an unintentional mix. tip of the head, and then of course the triceps, just the same as before, the deltoids, and then all the muscles of his upper and lower back. He's really a very chunky boy. Now, in time, these guys get replaced with plastics. Don't know what to say about the plastics. I've painted quite a few of them, and honestly, I find the plastics, and I think the plastics are still the current plastics. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't mean the blood crushers. I mean just the regular bloodletter infantry, right? The newer plastics with their sort of gangly limbs, I know what they were trying to reference, but I think those are some of the sorriest models um, in any range of Warhammer because they are just so repetitive and featureless and so utterly drained of personality that I can't see anybody painting them except in batches because individually they don't really deserve any more attention, and that's pretty sad. Like I know they're demons. I know they're not quite like blood, like plague bearers, where like plague bearers have a bit of a flavor to them because they were once mortal. That's one of the quirks about being a Nurgle worshipper is that eventually you get so overtaken by disease that you eventually get hollowed out and turn into a spreader of decay. But the new or the more recent plastic bloodletters are just so devoid of personality and charm. First of all, they already look like emaciated lizardmen Saurus or Seraphon, whatever you want to call them. And then they kind of just made them like just really identical with just a handful of poses. The whole look of them is dull, dull and uninteresting. Frankly, didn't love it. So yeah, not my favorite models, but if you're into them, more power to you. I just found them really not my cup of tea. Really lacking in personality and individuality. Yeah, and that's all I have to say about that. Not a great line of miniatures in my opinion. Cool. I'm gonna drop some Aethermatic blue into his eyes now, on a brighter note, because I find this color brings out some interesting effect. We left a bit of the original white undercoat in his eyes, and basically that gives us a good start point for working on highlights later on. So this is ice yellow mixed in with our Mantis Warriors green, and now we're going to define the very sharpest points. This is not unlike the mix that we use for Nagash, except Nagash we went down the route of shading instead of Warpstone Green. I think we used Ildari Emerald because that gives a more arcane kind of look. Khorne despises magic, so in honor of that, we're just making these look really venomous and dangerous looking. The difference is subtle, but if you know what you're looking for, and on the tabletop, actually they look quite different. Yeah. So ice yellow, again another wonderful Vallejo color for mixing highlights. Very similar to Dawn yellow if you're sticking to just Citadel paints. But if you're not sticking to just Citadel paints, then you can get hold of other colors to sort of broaden your range of tools. I would recommend ice yellow as one of the first Vallejo paints that you buy. because they can make a lot of difference to the final outcome of a miniature. So we're going on to pure ice yellow for the very extremities now. Right at the top, the apex of this point, and that's basically where we're drawing the eye to. The next thing we want to do is to do a bit of a highlight on that tabard. As mentioned, the teruges, the individual teruges, kind of are quite poorly defined, so they would definitely benefit from a little bit of extra help. So just gray, left and right of each teruge. As you can see, that really does help to bring this area to life and at least make it a bit less dull and kind of uniform. On the back, you have to fudge it because for some bizarre reason, the back doesn't have teruges. And I don't know why this would be the case, other than the sculptor maybe ran out of time or just didn't have that mirror front and back. A bit of silver allows us to help, some of these like points pop a little bit. But on the whole, I think we want to keep the metal fairly dark and not too glossy. Oops. That's not good. Right. Cool. Now the last bit of the eyes. I like to use ice yellow just to pick out the actual eyeballs, which are quite wonderfully sculpted on these, to be honest. Very clear. And then we might want to clean up a little bit around them with our red once more. Just to make sure that they are readable, especially on this side where I think I got a bit overzealous. There we go. Likewise, the bone, his teeth of death, right? Stand to be touched up a little bit, especially so that they don't spill onto his lips, his blood red lips. And again, darkening the bone just a little bit, just to keep things all nicely in proportion. Darkening his nails a bit, his claws, his talons. And I think we're good. I mean, there are still some areas that I think would benefit from a little bit more shading. So maybe we'll embark on a bit of that before we call it quits. But I think generally speaking, this bloodletter is looking quite resplendent, ready to take his place among the other teeth of death on what I assume would be called Jaws of Death, being the main unit, and maybe Head of Death, the Khorne army. Yeah, I like these names. I think they have personality and a lot of character. And yeah, this guy with his incredible Arnold Schwarzenegger muscles, his Schwarzeneggerian physique, and his Conan pose. So as the crown or tiara looking headpiece upon the troubled brow. Really makes these my favorite bloodletters. I know they're kind of like kitschy looking and a little bit cheeseball, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think he looks good. Handsome devil. Literally a handsome devil. And that air is... cool. Just tidying up the highlights a little bit from before, adding a little bit more shading to where it's needed. And I hope you can sort of see the benefits of using two different kinds of contrast-like paint. Basically the Xpress paint, which basically covers all the lighter sections, and then the actual contrast paint mix, which covers all of the darker sections to give a more unified finish, and to basically have a much larger range of color of pigment across the end result. A little bit more gold for the sword hilt. Like so. And I would say we are ready to rock. Alright guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I enjoyed painting him. Have a good one. Cheers. If you like this video, like, comment, subscribe, all that great stuff. And I'll see you guys again for the next one, which may or may not be another demon. Maybe you should let me know in the comments below which demon you'd like to see next. Horrors or Plague Bearers from this era as well, of course, 4th edition. Alright guys, have a good one. Cheers. Love you all. Bye-bye.